Hey guys, it's Goosebumps Completionist, and today I'm bringing you another book review from the classic original 62 book series, and it's book 47, Legend of the Lost Legend. Yikes. Off the bat, I remember as a young kid reading this book and thinking that it was not for me. And over the years, I think I have maybe read this book now collectively total of 3 to 4 times. That's including the time I read this for this review. And I have to say, out of all the Goosebumps books I have ever read, yes, I'm saying this cold-heartedly here. Cold-heartedly. This has to be the sloppiest Goosebumps book ever written. Bar none. If you want to throw up some Dr. Maniac examples, that's actually a fair thing to put up against this one. But holy crap, is this book a hot mess. I'll say this up front. Everything negative I have said on this channel prior to this review of this book, I still endorse and still fully stand behind. This book should not have been released, at least in the state that it was in. And this kind of mind boggles me how Scholastic, sometimes back in the day when Stein was putting out 2 to 3 books a month for the Goosebumps IP, which we all know were actually help with ghostwriters on like Give Yourself and Tales. Yes, that is an actual thing for people that are out there that don't agree with that. There's evidence of it. So deal with it. This book, I really feel like was phoned in by Parachute. It was probably submitted to them. And in a lot of ways, I don't even think that Stein wrote this book. It has a lot of Stein's writing qualities in it, but I don't think that he wrote the whole story. I literally think for this specific book, he wrote an outline, and they literally just put the outline to press. This is a depressing read. Probably one of the worst Goosebumps books of all time that I've ever read. If you have never read Legend of the Lost Legend, you could probably find it in modern day book tins. I think it's in the purple one. You're better off reading all the other ones from that tin than this one. This was actually a book that went unreprinted for many years. And I don't blame Scholastic for not reprinting this one because it's just a hot mess. And it's kind of embarrassing that they ever put the book out. And then the fact that they put it in a 10 years later kind of shows that they have no faith in it selling on its own on the shelves. I'm assuming this was a poor seller. That's why they didn't reprint it in the 2003 reprints. They probably used those numbers to dictate which ones got printed again. Yeah, I don't blame them on this one. It probably should stay Lost, as in the title, The Legend of the Lost Legend, ironically. But anyways, you know, if you're a fan, maybe you can give this a try. You know, after my rant there, you should try every book. You might like it more than I did, but I absolutely hate this book. So let's get into the plot overview without giving too much away. So the story involves these two siblings named Justin and Marissa. And Justin is the main character of the story. And off the bat, the first few chapters are actually a fake out, but it actually starts off kind of interesting where these two siblings, they're out in Antarctica, right? And seems too good to be true that we're going to have an Antarctic-based story. But anyways, they're out looking for this rare blue seal on the continent because their dad has dragged them there for exploration to help them discover this blue seal. And they have gotten separated from their father, but they end up finding evidence of this blue seal or whatever it is. And they try to get closer to it, which causes something tragic to happen, like with ice breaking and stuff. And before they can figure out what's going to happen next, the reader's hit with a recontextualization that all of this is a story being told by Justin and Marissa's father are at this campsite. And where they're at in real life, in the actual part of the story, is in this country called Brovania. And Brovania is an Eastern European country that has a lot of lore and urban legends and just old folk tales associated with it. And Justin and Marissa's father is there in Brovania in this wooded area where they're camping in because of this long running legend that's associated called the Lost Legend. And and their father really wants to be the person who makes the discovery of it after hundreds of years of this story going around. And Justin and Marissa also want to be a part of this discovery as well. And you hear some bits of Justin's monologue here, even though it's very brief, of how he really values his father's legacy and wants to make his dad proud. And that is something to kind of commend from his character, even though we don't really get to know much about either of these characters. And that stays true throughout the rest of the story. Well, anyways, once it's time to go to bed at their campsite, when their father goes to bed, Justin and Marissa are greeted by this funny looking dog with two different color eyes who is called Silver Dog. And attached to this dog is a note. And the note says, "I know why you're here. You need to follow the dog to find the answer to the legend you seek," or something like that. So the kids are kind of contemplating whether to try to wake up their dad or not. And they do attempt to, but they can't seem to wake him up. And then one of them, I think it's Marissa, is like, maybe we should go so we don't miss out on this discovery. Or I think it might be Justin. I don't think it really matters. But they're kind of bickering whether to stay with the dad or whether to go with the dog. Well, they decide to go with this Silver Dog. And they follow him initially, but then because of the apprehension, they get separated. And this is pretty much what you're going to expect throughout the rest of the book. So they get separated from the dog, but they hear like howling going on in the bushes. So they go to follow the noise, and it's complete pitch dark outside. And when they finally realize what they've been following, they have been following a deer. And this kind of worries them because they've kind of ventured off from the campsite and don't know where they're at. But they end up re-finding Silver Dog again, and Silver Dog takes them to this cabin. Now, at this cabin, they are greeted by this woman named Ivana. Now, Ivana is the person on this cover, who I have mentioned in the past as, a telltale sign if people actually truly remember this book. Well, Ivana is like, welcome, playing some jokes on the kids, making them think that they are trapped inside of the lodge and that they're going to have to eat some gross stuff and that. But Ivana's just playing around, and she is like, okay, if you want the legend that you seek, you have to pass a few tests. And the kids are like, what are these tests? We don't know what these are. Neither does the reader, and it's never really explained on it all. But anywho, Ivana's way of giving a test to them is by sending them out into the forest to discover where this legend is. So she sends them a travel companion known as Luca. And Luke is described in the story as like a were-dog creature with like a human face and body. He kind of crawls. It can like hop up on his hind legs and walk like a human. And he looks kind of gross. And the kids are like, okay, well, that's interesting. So they have to go along with this were-dog thing, Luca, into the forest, which I think is called Fantasy Forest, if I'm not mistaken. And it goes, like I said, it goes back hundreds of years. And the goal is to find this silver chest where the legend resides inside. So they head on this adventure with Luca out into the forest. Now, this is where the story just gets absolutely random. And when I say random, literally things just start happening that make no sense. Off the bat, one of the first things I can remember, because a lot of this starts to blend in my mind, if I'm being honest. I don't want to give too much away of what happens, because I think the random stuff is what this book is relatively known for here. But to give you a sense of what happens, they end up traveling, and Luca gets separated from him because he sees a squirrel, and these squirrels are like holding these huge giant nuts, and the two end up like finding this whole floor of like nuts that turn out to be kind of like eggs, and these giant squirrels are, like attacking them. But then once they realize something about the squirrels that might be kind of mechanical and you can turn them on and off and stuff like that, it kind of eliminates them as a threat. And Justin takes this idea to maybe, stash a couple in his bag so he can bring them home so he can pull pranks on people, right? So file that in the back of your brain. So once they come across these mechanized rats, they end up in this area of the forest where it's kind of muddy and shallow. They're shouting for Luca. Silver Dog has gotten away from the story at this point. They don't know, where Luca is. They're kind of struggling here. And they end up finding a section of the forest with like muddy terrain and stuff. And it has like these giant white trees with like bats hanging in them. But they hear some stomping going on, right? And the stomping ends up being giant black cats, right? And these giant black cats come down to essentially mess with Justin and Marissa. And let's just say Justin has a very close encounter with one of these giant black cats. And he's able to kind of save himself with some of those mechanized rats from earlier. And once they free themselves from that situation, they decide to go back to Ivana's cabin. When they get back to Ivana's cabin, they realize something very strange is going on here. And this is where I'm going to be very surface level from this point. Essentially, they discover if Ivana is actually real or not real. They discover the true identity of Luca, what this all means in contextualizing the story from beforehand up to that point. And pretty much what the test was, we finally learned it was pretty much trying to distinguish what's real and what's not real, stuff like that, jargon, yada yada stuff. And they may or may not be awarded with a prize. However, the story does not end there, because the last few chapters add on to it when the two interact with their father, and their father gets involved in the story. And let's just say the three of them find out what this lost legend really is. And that's where I'm going to end it here for this plot overview for this book. And that, in a nutshell, is what you're going to expect out of Legend of the Lost Legend. Let's just say this up front. I think the book I reviewed before this, Scariest Book Ever, is a way better version of this. In fact, there's a book from Series 2000 that reminds me a lot of this book called The Werewolf in the Living Room. I also think that that book is a vast improvement over this story as well. And here's why. In those two stories, there's at least some sort of plot structure going on. There's at least some sort of character moments you can latch onto. Aaron, the main character of, I think that's his name, Werewolf in the Living Room, really good character. The siblings from Scariest Book Ever, pretty good characters, enjoyable, fun enough. Justin and Marissa are pretty bland. And while they are on the blander side, my one token, or I guess two token positives, and they're not huge ones at all. But I do really appreciate bits of Justin's monologue when it's there, especially in the beginning, when we get a sense that Justin wants to, do something for his family's name and be a part of a big discovery larger than life. And I can really appreciate that because in a lot of ways that mirrors teenage fantasy stories. And I'm a big, massive fan of teenage fantasy stories, don't get me wrong. I would dare say that this kind of fits into that genre. It's not really horror. It's not really fantasy. It's just something all its own. But I can appreciate that about Justin's character, and that is a positive I have, right? And I guess another thing I like, there was a scene dealing with these rats that was kind of gross in like a disturbing way. Even though it was all for nothing, I still thought the scene was quite well written and pretty tense. So, good job to whoever wrote this book. But that leads me to my negatives. Going back to specifically Werewolf in the Living Room. I said that book had humongous scope problems and pacing issues, which are structure-based issues with a Goosebumps tale, especially with that what that book was trying to do. I definitely think it was a big swing and a miss. And in a lot of ways, that book didn't really feel like Stein wrote it because of how choppy it was. This, I think, takes the cake for sloppy because the story starts off with a dream fake out, and then right from the get go, you get thrown into this story of being in Brovania with a vague context of why they're there. You get hardly any characterization, anything to latch onto these characters with, and you're just thrown into a bunch of random nonsense. Nonsense that lacks logical explanation. It is very lazily recontextualized at a certain point of the story. The answers we get are rather cheap in very plot conveniency. And the whole book feels like it's a waste of time because it's an all for nothing story. And I know I just laid all those negatives out up front, but I'm doing that to stress my main issue and why I hate this book. Okay. There are 3 types of terrible Goosebumps books. The first type is the wet farts. You know, you have your unlikable characters, and then you have the dumb plots associated with them, or they're just taking, like if they're sequels, or taking away from the originals, giving the characters plot amnesia, making them dumb, nothing makes sense logically. Maybe gets into that offensive territory. It's played for humor, but the humor is not funny. Yeah, stuff like that. Those are your wet fart books. Then you have your outright hateable books, like the stuff that gets into bad taste territory or controversial territory that makes you physically ill or actually hate the book full on for its messages that it's sending or stuff like that. Then you have the third type of terrible Goosebumps books, which serve no purpose. And while I haven't really read a book that served no purpose, other than maybe Dr. Maniac Will See You Now, this is also in that camp. Because nothing in this book really matters. You can't latch on to anything I just listed off in the negatives, right? You know, you have poorly developed characters, poorly developed plot, loose things happening to call a plot. It's pretty much plotless. And the events are all recontextualized into being real and fake. So, especially when you get to the ending and you realize the scope of the story and what the title is alluding, we actually never get to experience what we thought the book was going to be about. And while I'm not the hugest stickler on that stuff, if I'm being honest, the titles and the covers, I'm not the biggest thing. You know, that's not my biggest thing I critique when I rate these books. But up front, if you think for 1 second that you're going to get any logical answer to what this lost legend is, you're in for a rude awakening when you read this book. I stress this again. This is the type of story, right? When you're reading it, you understand that you're just not into it. I think majority of people I've talked to that have read this book have the same emotions about it. They don't really find themselves outright hating it, like stuff that is just like in the bad taste territory or in the wet fart territory, but they also recognize that the book is nowhere near good at all. They actually agree that it's bad. And from what I gather, there are some people out there that have, you know, kind of shifted the narrative with certain books over the years. And this one seems to be not as hated from what I gather as it used to be. But I'm here to redirect the ship and put more hate back onto the book, because this is just one of those examples where whoever wrote this book did not try in any way, shape, or fashion to make a coherent story or something memorable here. And I could totally understand why this is in the top 5 most invisible Goosebumps books of all time. It makes perfect sense to me. And going back to another point that I made, the writing in this story I know Stein has written some really sloppy books in his time, but it's usually the ones that are just outliers, like really just poorly planned ones that just baffle me that Stein would do that. I refuse to believe Stein wrote this book. Okay. This is around the time in the series where, there was multiple series going on. I definitely think a ghostwriter wrote this. I can't prove it. I definitely, and I also think that like the first few chapters and maybe the final few have the textbook Stein stuff in there. And I will say this: whoever wrote this book, if it wasn't Stein, did an okay job with the Proust writing and painting visuals like Stein would. It's probably the closest I've seen, if it is the case, to that. But there are also some things in the writing that you'll catch on in terms of like going in and out of, Justin's monologue and his thoughts. Stein normally does this in his books, but not in the way he does it here. It's very odd, and you'll definitely notice it if you read it. That's why I'm just kind of calling it out. I really don't believe, with any shred of confidence, that Stein actually wrote this book, at least by himself. And it shows. It seems like maybe he came up with an outline, gave the outline to some ghostwriters. They filled in the outline portion in the sections, but Stein never went back over it to connect it all. He just said, okay, we got to put it out, send it to press. And it's depressing. The OG62 is a classic series, right? It's not known for having, well, it is known, but when you have books like this, right, that are just, you can't really commend anything about it. It's just rough, right? And that's what I'm struggling with in this review, because I love Goosebumps. I love Goosebumps as a whole. I'm a massive fan of its anthology outlet. I love R.L. Stein's flair he brings to these stories. But everything I love about Goosebumps isn't here. And if it is there, it's so brief and there's only mild glimpses of it that, it's going to get pushed in the back of my mind. And the only reason why I'm ever going to remember this book is for how much I hated reading it. It doesn't feel like Stein if he did write this, put any effort into it. And that sucks, right? I'm not saying that this problem isn't evident in other series. Trust me, it is. It's also evident in other OG62 books. But this one, man, this was a doozy. It really was. It's awful in its own way. And I hate it deeply. So from a 0 to 5 star basis, I'm sorry I've been taking this review so seriously, y'all, but you have to understand my struggle with this one. I'm on the fence of where I'm going to place this, because I'm going to be upfront. For all those negatives I have, pretty much for the entire book feeling like a waste of time in the worst ways possible, on every level possible you can weigh of something being bad in a book, it has those things going for it. It's already getting an F. And if you don't know my F tier, it's between a 1 and a 1.5 and a 2. Anything higher would be a 2.5 D minus, because I only do 0.5 increments for Fs. I'm actually on the fence of giving this book a 1 out of 5 stars. However, because I do have some positives with it, and those small things actually made me enjoy the brief moments they were there, I reluctantly give this a very, very low 1.5 out of 5 stars. Yeah, this is a flat F Goosebumps book for me. It's kind of baffling, and thankfully, recently we got that rectifying book of Scariest Book Ever, kind of doing this idea more justice. If you haven't read that book, go read this. Go read that instead of this book. As I said before, unless you're a massive fan or a completionist, or you have to read every Goosebumps tale, you can literally save this one for last, or next to last, or in the last handful, and you'll be fine, because you're not missing out on anything from this book. So yeah, that's my thoughts on Legend of the Lost Legend. Let me know down in the comment section if you've read this book before. Do you love this or do you hate this? I'm dying to know. And I'll see you next time.